Made glorious summer by the son of York, Richard III, 1592. Dramatis Personae. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later Richard III. King Edward IV and George, Duke of Clarence, Richard's brothers. Duchess of York, their mother. Queen Elizabeth, wife of Edward IV and mother of Edward, Prince of Wales, Richard, Duke of York, and Princess Elizabeth. Duke of Buckingham, trusted confidant to assist Richard to the throne. Lord Hastings, Lord Chamberlain to Edward IV. Lord Stanley, Earl of Derby, and stepfather to Richmond. Rivers, Grey, and Dorset, Queen Elizabeth's brother and her sons by her first marriage. Queen Margaret, widow of Henry VI and last of the Lancastrians, whose privacies against the House of York. Lady Anne, widow of Henry VI, son Edward. Henry, Earl of Richmond, stepson of Stanley and later Henry VII. Tyrrell, an assassin employed by Richard. The long and bloody civil war between the houses of York and Lancaster has ended with the murder in prison of the Lancastrian King Henry VI. Edward IV of York now reigns, and England can rejoice in peace. This is what Edward's brother Richard tells us at the opening of the play. He then invites us to watch as with devious skill he takes the throne for himself. Initially, we are intrigued by Richard's daring. He woos and wins Lady Anne as she escorts the funeral procession of her father-in-law, Henry VI. Then Richard plots against family and friends. He engineers the imprisonment and death of his brother Clarence, news of which sends his eldest brother, King Edward IV, to an early grave. Helped by the Duke of Buckingham, Richard sends Edward's sons, the young Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, to the Tower of London. When their mother's family objects, he has their male relatives executed. All of this is predicted by Henry VI's widow, old Margaret, who, filled with grief, haunts the place and in vain warns everyone against Richard. Richard now seeks the support of London citizens in making himself king. The silence shows public unease at Richard's ambition, but Buckingham's stage manages this into approval, and Richard takes the crown. Denied access to her sons, Queen Elizabeth fears the worst. Once he's on the throne, Richard tells Buckingham he wants his nephews dead. When Buckingham hesitates, Richard orders Tyrrell to kill them. Clouds gather for Richard as his surviving friends and enemies join forces. Buckingham deserts him to assist an invasion force from France led by the Earl of Buckingham. As Richard moves from London to challenge Richmond, his progress is interrupted by his mother, the Duchess of York, and Queen Elizabeth, who condemn him. He tried to turn this to his advantage by persuading the Queen to let him marry Princess Elizabeth now that Anne too is dead. Their encounter is a powerful one, and Richard believes he has won. But the Queen won't change sides. On the eve of the Battle of Bosworth, both Richard and Richmond dream of the ghosts of Richard's victims, who promised Richmond fortune and curse Richard as a traitor, murderer, and villain. Richard wakes sweating and tries to dismiss their words, but the voices of his conscience declares him guilty. When they meet in battle, Richmond kills the unhorsed Richard. Finally, Richmond promises that he and Elizabeth will bring England the peace and prosperity that Richard described at the start. In context: murderous villainy, ambition, loss, retribution. Setting: 15th century London and Leicestershire. Sources: 1st century, the tragedies of the Roman playwright Seneca. 14th to 15th centuries, the figure of vice and morality plays, the cyclical pattern of biblical parallels of the mystery plays. Circa 1520, Thomas More's History of King Richard III. Legacy: 1590s. Date of the first performance is unknown, but 5 reprints of the text by 1623 suggest the play was popular. 1700, Colby Cibber's adaptation dominates the stage until the late 1800s. 1955, Laurence Olivier's Old Vic production is, for some, the definitive Richard III. 1963 to 1964, Peter Hall and John Barson's RSC adaptation makes Richard, portrayed by a boyish Ian Holm, the dysfunctional product of a bloody feud. 1985, Anthony Scher's Spider-like Richard uses his crutches to dominate this RSC production. 1991, Richard Eyre's National Theatre production has set the play in 1930s England, where a fascist Richard, played by Ian McKellen, is a vengeful, mutilated war veteran. Richard's opening speech sets the stage by moving us from the wintry horrors of the battlefield to the summer holiday that peace has brought. Now, the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York. Act Act 1, Scene 1, verse lines 1 and 2. Only Richard's discontent remains. Mocking the idle courtly life in a tone that is increasingly ironic, he resolves to let his dissatisfaction darken Edward IV's sun-filled reign. I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. Richard, Act 1, Scene 1. Politics in the past. Richard's a more subtle operator in this fourth play of Shakespeare's Henry VI tetralogy than he was in Part 3, where once he would have used violence, now he manipulates court infighting and the self-interest of ambitious men. Shakespeare gives him the cunning of a Machiavel and reinforces this by moving most of the bloodletting off stage, although not every modern director keeps it there. Queen Elizabeth was a widow who married Edward IV after refusing to be his mistress, much to his family's disgust. Richard plays on class consciousness, setting up her brother and two young sons by her former marriage as social climbers, silk and sly insinuating jacks. Alexa, stop!
Take my hand.
Alexa, stop! Sorry. Act 1, Scene 3, line 53. He then blames them for his plot, the imprisonment of his brother Clarence and Lord Hastings, and accuses them of having ambitious designs on the new young king. This allows him to play the kindly uncle and lodge the two boys in the Tower of London. Shortly afterward, he has Rivers, Dorset, and Grey executed. Such a swift rise to power relies on the collusion of others, Buckingham, Catesby, Hastings, and the Bishop of Ely. Even Richmond's stepfather Stanley may not be duped by Richard, but they all stay silent about what they know. Are you drawn forth among a world of men to slay the innocent? Clarence, Act 1, Scene 4. Settling history's account. To a degree, Richard's plotting brings down those figures who were disloyal to the House of York during the Civil War. Most of this is predicted by old Queen Margaret, the widow of Henry VI, who appears anachronistically at court to call down vengeance on those who for so long set brother against brother. She conveniently forgets her own role in the fighting, as Richard observes, but she starts out a pattern of retributive vengeance that echoes history's script, one that we watch Richard go on to fulfill. Apart from Queen Margaret, no one at court speaks out against Richard's acts, but in the London streets, the citizens do. The first half of the play is confined to a London that Richard clearly regards as his domain, but the commoners represent a wider audience whose judgment Richard's clever performance can't control. Another part of this audience comprises the women, Queen Anne Margaret, the Duchess of York, and Queen Elizabeth. They watch and remember. As Richard's mother points out, women are often the sole surviving keepers of accounts. In the picture scene here, English actor Laurence Olivier played Richard as an alluring satanic gesture in the 1955 film adaptation. 1955, that is. It was often shot in close-up, malevolently confiding to the camera. The landscape widens. Dreams, nightmares, curses, prophecies, and premonitions present a metaphysical dynamic in the play beyond Richard's control. As soon as he murders the innocent princess in the tower, his fortunes begin to fall. He becomes prey to doubts and fears, and Anne reveals that he's long had timorous dreams. Act 4, Scene 1, line 84. With his first careful words as king, he tries to share responsibility for the coup with Buckingham. Thus high by thigh by assistance is King Richard seated. Act 4, Scene 2, lines 4 through 5. But Buckingham grows suspicious, and this puts their double act under strain. Just when Richard needs help from his self-interested friends, confined as he now is at the center of the action, he finds himself increasingly isolated and dependent on strangers such as Tyrrell to complete his plots. Buckingham's departure from the court heralds the warning of Richard's sole command of the action and also prompts Richard's arrival on the scene. We learn of his planned invasion from France, secretly supported by Lord Stanley and Queen Elizabeth. Now the action of the play opens up and moves from London's Square Mile to rural Leicestershire, the heart of England, to Bosworth Field. As the seasons turn from Richard's busy sunshine to his autumnal fall, Margaret returns. In a counterpart to Richard's prologue, she is in the inevitable conclusion. And so now prosperity begins to mellow and drop into the rotten mouth of death. Act 4, Scene 4, lines 1 and 2. Would you enforce me to a world of cares? Call them again, I am not made of stone. Richard, Act 3, Scene 7. The shape of villainy. Richard's physical shape is a gift to any dramatist, and Shakespeare makes much of it. Many in the audience would have enjoyed the hugely successful Henry VI plays, and also known the crookback figure as he is portrayed in Tudor history, a monstrous creature, a bloody civil war, and a future demon king. Shakespeare capitalizes on Richard's physical nonconformity by making it his motivating force. In the preceding play, he severs all links to family and faction and sets himself against the principle of bond that took York and Lancaster to war. Given his deformity, he feels that family bonds and natural inheritance have let him down. He decides, therefore, to be self-sufficient. I am myself alone, and like an actor, turns his shape to advantage by playing his way to the throne. This is the performance he introduces us to at the opening of the play. There he lets in on his plot and simplifies history into fiction with its heroes, lovers, and villains. The disruptive force of Richard's villainous nonconformity is clear in his first 5 appearances in the play. Upsetting the smooth running of Edward IV's new slate, he interrupts a series of courtly ceremonies and meetings and redirects them all. Some productions show him appearing through a different entrance from that used by the other characters, as if, like the morality play figure Vice, he comes to create chaos from quite another place. Wit and wordplay. Richard shows us that he's the master of improvised duplicity, especially with language, and he's equally at home in street speech and witty repartee. His versatility takes him from mocking to mock modesty. The wit and smooth rhetoric that let him catch his opponents off guard often take us in the same way. His verbal skills are to the fore when he persuades Lady Anne to be his wife, Act 1, Scene 2, and Queen Elizabeth to let him marry her daughter, Act 4, Scene 4. Strategically placed at each end of the play, these parallel scenes chart the rise and fall of Richard's fortunes. He approaches Queen Elizabeth with the same bravado, but she turns his tactics back on him. This time the woman leads the debate. Her put-downs are delivered with such feeling that they stifle Richard's efforts to defend his evil actions. At the end, Richard stops the performance and no longer drives us into his confidence. When he tries not to despair on the night before Bosworth, his soliloquy addresses a fresh audience, his conscience. The debate is a judicial examination, devoid of witty self-deceptions, with Richard both the prosecution and the defense. Finally, his conscience tells him that he is the villain he promised to be. My conscience hath 1,000 several tongues, and every tale condemns me for a villain. If something thou wouldst swear to be believed, swear then by something that thou hast not wronged. Queen Elizabeth, Act 4, Scene 4. In this picture, American actor Kevin Spacey plays Richard as a self-hating, power-crazed despot who revolted the play's woman in Sam Mendes' acclaimed 2011 production at the Old Vic in London. From sun to shade, now we watch as Richard is disturbed by prophecies and curses. He can't sleep before his final battle, and the sun fails to shine the day he dies. Ultimately, he's defeated both in history in the form of Richmond and by himself. Myself confound. Act 4, Scene 4, line 330. He admits that he has no pity even for himself. In performance, it's the strength of Richard's prowess in the battle that often determines our feelings about him at the end. Perhaps his cry, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" Act 5, Scene 7, line 7, reminds us that he was always happiest in a fight. Richmond ends the play, but the final focus also rests on Richard. Behind Richmond's perfect picture of smiling plenty and fair prosperous days, Act 5, Scene 7, line 34, there lingers a shadow of Richmond's sun-filled opening words. Tudor propaganda. John Roos, a historian writing during the reign of Richard III, describes his king as a good lord with a great heart who enacted just laws. But by the reign of the first Tudor king, Henry VII, Roos had reversed his opinion. Richard, he wrote, was a freak. Stunted and physically weak, he was responsible for killing Henry VI and poisoning his own wife. Other historians, among them Sir Thomas More, joined in the vilification of Richard, saying his crooked back deformity as evidence of inward corruption. It may be that More and others were seeking to legitimize Tudor rule with anti-Yorkist propaganda, but it is from their accounts that Shakespeare drew his material. More described Richard as being devious and flattering while he plotted, but also clever and courageous. Shakespeare retained all these features and gave the king added depth by encumbering him with a formidable conscience. The character is so enduring that the historical Richard has been elaborated. Indeed, there is no surviving account by anyone who knew him in person.